Photos from my grandfather's basement. Caleb Cross descended the creaking wooden steps into the dimly lit basement, a cloud of dust swirling around his feet. The weight of loss hung heavy as he moved further into the cluttered space, tasked with sifting through his deceased grandfather Milton's belongings. Surrounded by a lifetime's worth of trinkets and treasures, Caleb's fingers grazed over each object. He wondered about the stories behind them, the moments in time that they had witnessed. His heart tightened with sadness at the thought of discarding these remnants of his grandfather's life. As he shifted a stack of yellowed newspapers, Caleb's curiosity piqued when he noticed a dusty old photo album hidden among the clutter. It was partially obscured by an old sheet, as though it were deliberately tucked away from prying eyes. He delicately removed the sheet to reveal the photo album. The worn leather cover of the album seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets, its faded gold lettering on the front barely legible. The letters spelled out, "Light abandoned, lock away," and, beneath them, a date showing it's from several decades ago. A tingling sensation crept up Caleb's spine, as if the album itself were whispering to him to take a closer look. Caleb's anticipation swelled as he carefully lifted the album, feeling the weight of its history in his hands. The leather was worn and weathered, yet it exuded a sense of dignity that hinted at forgotten stories. His fingers traced the embossed letters with an almost sacred reverence before gently prying the cover open. The sound of the album creaking open was like the slow exhale of a long-held breath, echoing through the basement. As Caleb turned each page, he was met with a collection of really old photographs. His eyes drank in the images, each one a glimpse into the past that seemed to pull him further into the world they inhabited. Shadows danced across the faces of people long gone. A shiver of fascination and horror coursed through Caleb as he flipped through the pages, unable to tear himself away from the strange allure of these frozen moments in time. The basement's shadows seemed to deepen, leaning in closer with each passing moment. Caleb could feel the hairs on the back of his neck prickling, as if unseen eyes were watching him, urging him to delve deeper into the album's secrets. With each turn of the page, Caleb's heart raced faster, his breaths growing more shallow. The shiver inside him grew, yet couldn't bring himself to look away. The lure of the unknown was too powerful to resist, even as the chill in the basement burrowed into his bones. As he continued to sift through the relics of the past, Caleb found himself lost in a world of haunting beauty and sinister intrigue. Each photograph offered another piece of the puzzle, beckoning him to uncover more of the story hidden beneath layers of dust and time from his grandfather's life. Caleb's fingers trembled slightly as his eyes were fixed on one particular photograph. It seemed to pulse with an energy that made the air around it feel charged, electric. An involuntary shudder ran down his spine, but despite the growing sense of unease, Caleb found himself irresistibly drawn to this peculiar snapshot of the past. The image itself was unlike any he had encountered before, dark and foreboding in black and white, yet strangely captivating. The scene depicted a landscape where twisted trees reached toward the sky like gnarled fingers, their shadows stretching unnaturally long across the grass. Above them, clouds roiled and churned, casting the entire tableau in a sinister, otherworldly light. As Caleb delved deeper into the photograph, he discerned something unsettling near the gnarled tree at its center. The branches twisted, reaching for the ground, and an eerie black mist, grotesque yet barely visible, lingered near the tree. The longer he fixated on the photo and the mist, the more the atmosphere seemed to transform, shifting from a malevolent grin to a silent scream that pierced the very marrow of his bones. Beneath the photograph, strange markings alongside words written in an unfamiliar script. They appeared ancient, almost primal, their curves and angles weaving together in a dizzying pattern that seemed to pulsate and undulate when viewed from the corner of his eye. Caleb struggled to decipher the cryptic symbols, each strokey and line adding weight to the growing dread that lingered in the pit of his stomach. With every passing second, the basement's atmosphere grew heavier, the air thickening into a palpable fog that pressed down upon Caleb. The shadows, once merely observers, now seemed to close in on Caleb, their tendrils reaching for the photograph as if attempting to claim it for themselves. Caleb's mind raced with conflicting desires, torn between the urge to investigate further and the primal instinct to flee from the unsettling photo album. The shadows seemed to whisper to him, urging him closer, promising dark secrets that could forever alter his perception of reality. Yet, the chilling energy emanating from the picture threatened to shatter his very sanity, warning him of the unspeakable horrors that lay just beneath the surface. His fingers hovered above the photo, trembling at the thought of touching the image. He imagined the cold sensation of the paper against his skin, the malicious energies seeping into his body and corrupting his soul. As Caleb stared at the photograph, transfixed by the darkness that beckoned him forth, he couldn't help but feel as if he were on the precipice of a great discovery, one that would either elevate him to new heights or plunge him into an abyss from which there was no escape. The weight of this potential knowledge gnawed at him, an insatiable hunger that demanded satisfaction, even as it threatened to devour him whole. And then, without warning, the face within the photograph shifted, its features becoming distorted, blurry, and transparent. Caleb squinted, trying to make sense of the apparition before him, when suddenly the phantom visage moved. It twisted and contorted, its eyes locking onto his with an intensity that sent waves of terror coursing through his veins. In that heart-stopping moment, Caleb slammed the album shut, the force of the action sending a cloud of dust billowing into the stagnant air. The album slipped from his grasp, tumbling to the cold concrete floor with a heavy thud that echoed throughout the basement. As if in response to this sudden disturbance, a strange wind began to swirl around Caleb, its icy tendrils nipping at his skin and tugging at his clothes. In the basement, an atmospheric shift gripped the air as Caleb was immersed in a disconcerting high-pitched noise. Caleb's heart raced as he rushed out of the basement, slamming the door shut behind him. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister lingered, reaching out to him from the depths of his grandfather's home. Leaning against the door, Caleb's thoughts spiraled. What had Milton been doing all those years? His grandfather had always been secretive, but now, with the family's dark past unfolding, it seemed there was far more to Milton than met the eye. Caleb's eyes fixated on the coffee table in the living room. The photo album rested there, looming over him like a ghostly presence. Caleb couldn't believe it. He felt a shiver going through his body. He had left the photo album in the basement when he rushed upstairs, but somehow it was here now. The urge to pick it up was overwhelming, yet Caleb couldn't bring himself to do so. Instead, he walked around the living room, as if in a trance, drawn towards something he knew he should leave alone. He peered into every corner of the room, looking for clues, but finding nothing. It drew him in, an irresistible force that demanded his attention. Fearful curiosity gnawed at him, urging him to delve deeper into its contents. He knew he shouldn't, but something compelled him to approach the table. His footsteps creaked on the wooden floorboards. With every step, his heartbeat quickened, a primal instinct telling him to run, to flee from the darkness within the pages of that cursed album. But he couldn't. The fear and fascination held him captive, binding him to this strange artifact left behind by his grandfather. He reached out, trembling fingers hovering above the cover. With a gentle touch, he was bound. At that moment, he knew he wouldn't leave the album alone. He hesitated, his hand lying on the cover, recalling the chilling photograph that had nearly frightened him to death. The photograph of the ghostly apparition. Caleb's heart raced in his chest, yet he couldn't deny the curiosity that tugged at him. Swallowing hard, He steeled himself and opened the album, revealing the page with the haunting photograph. As he studied it, the image seemed to keep shifting ever so slightly, drawing him deeper into its mystery. He squinted, attempting to decipher the symbols, but their meanings remained elusive. Caleb's pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the silence that enveloped the room. Focus, he thought to himself, willing his mind to untangle the web of symbols sprawled across the weathered page. But the harder he tried, the further the truth seemed to slip away. He felt like the room was pressing in on him, trapping him within its confines. His head spun, disoriented by the dizzying array of characters that swam before his eyes. And then, in a flash of clarity, the symbols began to make sense. A sudden understanding washed over Caleb, and he found himself able to read some words of the ancient text. His heart leaped in his chest, but the elation was short-lived. For the truth that unfolded before him was darker, more terrifying than any horror he could have ever imagined. Caleb's chest constricted, each breath a labored struggle. Whispers began as indistinct murmurs, growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. They tormented him from all corners of the room. His heart and mind raced. Panic clawed at his insides, demanding attention. Still, Caleb focused on the photograph, clinging to it as his only anchor. As he stared, eyes wide and unblinking, the realization struck him like a hammer blow. The apparition that once haunted the picture was gone, vanished without a trace. A cold terror seeped into his bones. Where did it go? His thoughts screamed, seeking answers that refused to reveal themselves. The room swayed around him, disorienting and dizzying in its relentless assault on his senses. Caleb fought to maintain control, to push away the fear that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more forceful, until they threatened to drown out all else. The shadows closed in, smothering the light, leaving the page hard for Caleb to see. The ancient writings seemed to writhe beneath Caleb's trembling fingers, a cacophony of voices whispering from the very walls themselves. His heart hammered. His eyes darted back to the photograph, fear gripping him tighter with each passing second. The apparition was gone, leaving only questions. Where is it? What is it? He urged himself to find some meaning, frantically searching the page for any semblance of hope. There must be something here, some way to escape this nightmare. He thought to himself. Think. And then, amidst the chaos and the darkness, a single word emerged from the swirling symbols. Beware. It seemed to burn through the page, etching itself into his mind, searing its warning into his very soul. Beware. Of what? He wondered, his pulse pounding in his ears. Before he could ponder further, the room shuddered violently, as if rocked by an unseen force. At once, his body paralyzed by primal terror. In the dim light, the shadows coalesced, forming a shape so sinister and menacing that Caleb's blood froze in his veins. The specter of the apparition loomed before him, its hollow eyes boring into his soul, a silent scream etched upon its face. Beware, the word echoed in his head. Beware. It was clear now, the whispers from the shadows. They were trying to warn Caleb. Caleb's heart raced as he sprinted from his grandfather's house, the chilling presence of the malevolent spirit lingering in the air behind him. The night was cold and damp, his breath visible in the darkness. Panicking, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Not now. The nearby small town beckoned, the faint glow of streetlights offering a beacon of hope. As Caleb stumbled through the deserted streets, despair threatened to consume him. He needed help, someone who could guide him through this nightmare. But where would he find such a person? The question gnawed at his mind until an old, weather-beaten storefront caught his eye. A psychic, Perhaps they could offer some insight into the spirit that haunted him so relentlessly. Hesitantly, he entered, the scent of incense heavy in the air. The psychic listened intently as Caleb recounted his harrowing tale. Their eyes widened with fear and disbelief, shaking their head. The psychic's only help was a warning to not anger the spirits. Not much help, not at all useful. Caleb's next stop, a church, its ancient steeple looming over the town. Surely a priest would know something about banishing evil. Caleb poured his heart out once more, hoping for solace and guidance. The priest listened solemnly, concern etched across his aged face. Unfortunately, his knowledge of the paranormal was limited, providing only the barest scraps of information. He had one thing they could attempt, though. Almost a decade had passed since he had last performed this ritual. The priest was uncertain if it would be of any use, but he still asked Caleb to accompany him to the back room of the church. He had all the necessary tools and objects for the ceremony, yet he questioned his own abilities. The priest's hands trembled as he lit the candles, their flickering light casting shadows across the church walls. Caleb's pulse raced, his chest tightening. Was this really happening? He clung to the hope that the ritual would banish the evil haunting him or just give him a break to figure out his next move, but doubt gnawed at him. In the dim glow, the priest murmured ancient incantations, his voice barely audible above the wind howling outside. Caleb's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of the spirit's presence. His heart pounded, listening to every creak of the floorboards and the wind and rustle of fabrics. The ritual reached its crescendo, the priest's voice growing louder, more forceful. A sudden gust of wind blew out the candles, plunging the room into darkness. Silence hung heavy. Even the storm outside seemed to be holding its breath. Then, the air grew cold. So cold it hurt to breathe. The oppressive chill suffocated Caleb, squeezing his lungs like a vice. This wasn't right. It wasn't working. A low growl resonated through the church, the sound of pure rage. The ritual had failed, and it had only made the malevolent spirit angrier. Despair crushed Caleb's heart as the priest muttered apologies and hurriedly ushered him out of the sanctuary. Alone in the dark streets, Caleb felt his sanity teetering on the brink. This couldn't be real. Spirits and curses belonged in horror stories, not his life. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. Something sinister was haunting him. His legs carried him aimlessly through the town, seeking help that seemed non-existent. Each step felt heavier than the last. Caleb's eyes searched the darkness for a sign of hope, anything to cling to in the face of this nightmare. But as he wandered deeper into the shadows, it became increasingly clear. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. A faint light flickered in the distance, drawing Caleb like a moth to a flame. He stumbled towards it, legs weak and trembling. The light emanated from a small building nestled between crumbling brick facades, an antique store by the looks of it. Yet as he drew closer, the garish sign proclaimed otherwise. Tate's Paranormal Investigators. A ray of hope. He pushed open the door. Inside, a group huddled around a table littered with strange gadgets and old books. They glanced up at his entrance, faces etched with curiosity. Caleb's desperation spilled forth, a torrent of words imploring them for their expertise, begging for any chance at deliverance from the malevolent spirit that tormented him. In the face of his anguish, they relented, agreeing to perform a seance. They gathered in a circle, hands clasped together, eyes shut tight against the unseen world. Caleb's breath hitched in his throat, anticipation and dread warring within him. What if this failed too? The room darkened, and a palpable pressure built in the air. Caleb's heart raced, adrenaline surging through his veins. Sweat beaded on his brow as he clung to the hands of the investigators, silently praying for release. Then, chaos erupted. Objects flew from shelves, crashing into walls and shattering on the floor. The temperature plummeted, icy tendrils wrapping around their bones. Screams tore through the air, mingling with guttural growls and piercing shrieks. Fear clawed at Caleb. The malevolent spirit manifested, a swirling vortex of darkness and malevolence. Its rage was palpable, a force that sent the investigators reeling, their grip on one another slipping. Caleb's mind was in a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. It shouldn't be possible. But as the room trembled beneath the spirit's fury, reality crashed down upon him. This nightmare was far from over. His legs gave way, collapsing to the floor as he gasped for breath. The spirit loomed above him, its anger burning like a furious sun. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself the strength to wake up, to escape this living hell. But there was no escaping the truth. This was real, and the malevolent spirit would not rest. Seizing the momentary distraction, Caleb lurched towards the door, heart pounding in his ears. His fingers fumbled for the doorknob, slippery with sweat, as the room continued to quake under the spirit's wrath. With a final twist and push, the door flew open, and Caleb stumbled out into the dimly lit hallway. He did not dare look back. The haunting pursued him relentlessly, shadows elongating and twisting grotesquely on the walls, windows shattered in his wake, glass shards raining down like deadly confetti. The very air around him seemed to vibrate with malicious intent. Caleb's legs burned, muscles protesting against his frenzied sprint. He couldn't hold on much longer, but the thought of stopping, of allowing the malevolent spirit to catch him, spurred him on. Finally, his motel room came into view. Relief flooded through him, albeit momentarily. He knew it was only a temporary reprieve from the torment that had become his existence. Slamming the door shut behind him, he collapsed onto the bed, chest heaving. His mind raced, full of unanswered questions. Why him? What could he have possibly done to deserve this unrelenting nightmare? Exhaustion weighed heavy on his eyelids. Ultimately, he couldn't resist the siren call of sleep. His eyes closed, slipping into the realm of dreams. It didn't take long for the malevolent spirit to invade, its presence permeating the very fabric of his subconscious. In the dreamscape, Caleb found himself trapped in a labyrinth of twisted hallways that stretched on endlessly, each turn leading him further into darkness. Voices whispered his name, echoing through the corridors like a malevolent chorus. Shadows slithered around him, morphing into grotesque figures. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, leaving Caleb to question if he would ever escape this torment. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the nightmare ended. Caleb jolted awake, gasping for breath, the image of the malevolent spirit seared into his mind's eye. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled through the town. The cold grip of terror still clung to him, scared that every shadow would reveal the malevolent spirit. He needed answers. The small, dilapidated building that passed for a library in this town came into view, tucked away in a corner of something that resembled the city hall. Caleb pushed open the creaking door. Dust swirled in the dark, fading room. Caleb's eyes darted across shelves, fingertips brushing spines as if they could impart their knowledge through touch alone. He pulled out tome after tome, frantically flipping through pages, desperate for a clue, a hint, anything to help him understand. Hours slipped by, unnoticed by Caleb as he delved deeper into the recesses of the library. The words blurred together, the cramped writing in biblical texts nearly indecipherable. But then, there it was, a single line in an old forgotten journal, a reference to a lost soul consumed by lies and deceitful schemes. Could this be the key to understanding the spirit haunting him? Caleb's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. Who could this soul be? How were they connected to him and the cursed photograph? He felt like he was standing at the edge of a precipice, teetering between revelation and madness. His hands shook as he continued to sift through the dusty archives. He couldn't shake the images from his mind, dark shadows creeping along the walls, distorted faces leering at him from the corners of his vision. The unknown spirit, fueled by lies and deceit, haunted not only his home, but also his very soul. Exhaustion weighed him down. His eyelids grew heavier and heavier. As he slumped over the desk, surrounded by the musty scent of ancient texts and crumbling paper, he surrendered to the Sandman's embrace. His dreams were far from respite. Instead, they plunged him into a nightmarish realm where the malevolent spirit reigned supreme. Twisted shapes flickered on the periphery, always lurking, never revealing themselves fully. A cold finger of fear traced its way down Caleb's spine. Then, a face emerged from the gloom, one both achingly familiar and painfully foreign. Milton, his deceased grandfather, stared at him with hollow, accusing eyes. His image warped and twisted, merging with the sinister aura that pervaded this shadowy world. Caleb's breath caught in his throat, caught between disbelief and a crushing sense of betrayal. How could his beloved grandfather be the source of this malevolence? What dark secrets had been buried beneath a facade of love and guidance? As the specter of Milton loomed closer, Caleb's heart raced, each frantic beat screaming for him to wake up. Caleb jolted awake, heart pounding from the nightmare. Gasping for air, he tried to make sense of the nightmare that still clung to the edges of his mind. Milton, his own grandfather, the haunting face of evil. He shuddered. As panic subsided, Caleb realized he was no longer in the cramped library where he'd fallen asleep. The musty smell of old books had been replaced by the scent of fresh-cut grass and horse manure. Blinking, he surveyed the room. It wasn't his room, nor any place he recognized. His breath hitched as he took in the wooden walls adorned with antique photographs and fading walls. This couldn't be real. He must still be dreaming. But the pain in his knuckles from gripping the bed frame felt too real, too vivid. The room began to spin, and Caleb fought the urge to vomit. No, this wasn't a dream. It was something far more sinister. He was back in time, trapped in the era of the photograph that had started it all. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. What did this mean? Why had his grandfather brought him here? Desperate to understand, Caleb searched the room for clues, anything that could shed light on the dark secrets that seemed to have ensnared both him and his family. He stumbled to the window, hoping to find solace in the view outside. Instead, he found himself staring at the very scene captured in the photograph. The same gnarled tree, its twisted and contorted branches. As Caleb looked at the tree, he couldn't see any grotesque figure like in the photograph. Instead, his grandfather stood by the tree. A chill ran through Caleb as the weight of his predicament settled upon him. He was trapped in the past with a malevolent spirit, his own grandfather. Caleb's vision blurred, feeling like his mind was playing a trick on him. As he stood, watching his grandfather, Milton, and the woman who would become his grandmother. Her eyes were sunken with exhaustion, her once vibrant hair now dull and lifeless. A priest's collar encircled her neck, an unusual sight for a woman in those days. Caleb felt an ache in his chest, a heavy sadness as he observed their desperate longing to be parents. His grandmother's barrenness weighed heavily on them both, but it was her inexplicable illness that truly haunted the couple. As if sensing Caleb's presence, Milton glanced towards the corner where he stood, though their eyes never met. Caleb knew he couldn't interact with his grandfather. He was there, but not almost as a spectral observer between worlds. Desperation drove Milton to seek help through the paranormal. Furtive glances confirmed the coast was clear before he retrieved a hidden book from beneath the floorboards. The musty pages creaked as they turned, revealing a ritual for a seance, one that could cure his wife's ailment and grant her the gift of fertility. Unbeknownst to her, Milton made the decision that would change their lives forever. Caleb watched cautiously, his heart pounding with anticipation. The room grew colder as Milton began the seance. He followed each step meticulously, reciting ancient incantations and invoking ethereal forces beyond his understanding. There was no turning back now. Outside, the wind howled and battered against the windows, yet Caleb remained transfixed by the scene unfolding before him, the atmosphere growing more oppressive with every moment. Unable to look away, he studied his grandparents' faces, their hope, their fear, their love, the emotions that drove them to this fateful decision. Milton held his breath, waiting for a sign, and in that silence, Caleb understood the weight of their choices and the darkness that had been unleashed upon his family. The love between his grandparents was evident, but so too was the suffering they would endure for generations to come. Caleb wanted to scream, to warn them of the consequences they could not foresee, but he was powerless, a mere witness to the past, unable to change the course of history. As the room returned to normal, the shadows receding and the temperature rising, he knew one thing was certain. The malevolent spirit that haunted his family's legacy had its roots in this very moment, and he knew that only he could break the curse that had bound them for so long. The candlelight flickered, casting eerie shadows on Milton's face as he finished the incantation. Caleb, still invisible and unable to interact, held his breath, a sense of foreboding settling over him. A dark mist began to form, swirling around Milton like a malevolent storm. Caleb's heart raced. The mist surged through Milton, slithered through the small crack under the door, disappearing into the room where Milton's wife lay frail and ill. Caleb tensed, his eyes glued to the scene unfolding before him. His grandfather's expression shifted from fear to hope, a desperate yearning for the miracle they sought. Time seemed to stand still, the air thick and heavy. In the adjoining room, a soft gasp echoed, followed by the sound of labored breathing stabilizing. Caleb's pulse quickened as he realized the seance had worked. Milton's wife was no longer tormented by her illness, her body now able to carry life. As Milton's relief washed over his weary face, the shadows in the room gathered, forming a silhouette of a woman. The figure hovered in front of Milton for an instant before vanishing into the darkness once more. In that fleeting moment, the path of their lives had been changed forever. A newfound strength could be seen in Milton's gaze, determination to protect and nurture the family they so desperately desired. Yet Caleb knew all too well the price not only they would pay for their happiness, but also for generations to come, and the evil that lurked in the shadows of their home. As Milton embraced his now healthy wife, her belly growing with life, Caleb's heart ached with a mix of joy and sorrow. He understood the depth of their love and sacrifice, but could not shake the feeling of impending doom. As the scene began to fade, Caleb clung to the memory of his grandparents' smiles, vowing to break the curse that had plagued them for generations. The malevolent spirit would not haunt them any longer, not if he could help it. Time moved relentlessly forward, and the once healthy glow of Milton's wife began to fade. Her body, frail and weary, struggled against the birth pangs that grip at her mercilessly. Caleb watched in silent anguish as his grandfather clutched her hand, a glimmer of hope still shining in his eyes. The baby girl's first cries pierced the air, echoing through the room. But joy was short-lived as the mother's body succumbed to exhaustion, her breaths growing labored and shallow. The scent of blood and sweat filled Caleb's nostrils, leaving him helpless as he bore witness to the unfolding tragedy. Milton's face contorted with pain, tears streaming down his cheeks. He looked upon his newborn daughter, cradling her tiny form with trembling hands. Within his heart, determination took root. He would be her rock, nurturing her every step of the way. His fingers traced the curve of her cheek, memorizing every detail. A promise etched itself into his soul. She would know love, happiness, and safety, no matter the cost. Grief and responsibility battled within him, but his resolve held strong. As Caleb observed the scene, his own heart twisted in agony. The spirit's curse had brought life, yet also dealt death. Anger burned within him, directed at the malevolent entity that haunted his family tree. Though without this evil force, he himself would never have existed. He stood on the precipice between gratitude and bitterness, the weight of understanding bearing down on his shoulders. In this liminal space, he knew what must be done. The darkness could not be allowed to fester, to taint their lives any longer. Caleb's heart raced as he scanned the ancient book his grandfather had used to summon the spirit. The cramped, spidery handwriting seemed to crawl across the parchment as he searched for a ritual to banish the malevolent spirit. The weight of his family's dark past bore heavily on his chest, suffocating him with a mixture of anger and sadness. Finally, his eyes settled upon the words he sought, a ritual promising freedom from the haunting entity. He gathered the necessary items, hands trembling with anticipation, and set them out methodically before him. A shiver ran down his spine as he began to recite the incantation, his voice barely above a whisper. The ground trembled beneath his feet, causing him to grip the edges of the table for support. Despite his terror, he continued to chant, urging himself onward. A thick mist swirled into existence, tendrils of fog snaking around his ankles and climbing higher. A figure materialized within the haze, the silhouette of a woman, her very presence seethed with malice, her eyes twin voids that threatened to swallow him whole. Caleb's breath caught in his throat, panic seizing his every nerve. He blinked, and she vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. His vision swam, darkness encroaching upon the periphery. As his knees buckled, the mist enveloped him completely, blocking his sight, before passing out. Consciousness returned slowly, creeping back like the first rays of dawn. Caleb groaned, his head pounding as if it were trapped in a vice. His surroundings seemed familiar, the damp basement air, the musty smell of old basement and mildew. But this was not where he had been moments before. He was seated at a table, the same one from his grandfather's basement. On its surface lay the haunting photo album. Confusion and fear battled within his chest as he tried to make sense of it all. He had performed the ritual. The spirit had disappeared. Yet here he was, back in this dank basement with the very source of his torment. Caleb thought about what had happened. Was it all over? Did he really banish the spirit? Caleb's racing thoughts collided with one another. He needed to be certain that the ritual had worked, that the spirit would no longer haunt his family. But how could he be sure? His eyes were drawn back to the photo album, its pages holding the key to his family's past, and perhaps their future. And so, he reached for the album, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Caleb studied the photograph, searching for the familiar, swirling mist that once lurked by the tree. Gone. Relief washed over him like a warm breeze on a chilly night. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Perhaps it was finally over. But victory was fleeting. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as he rose from the table. Each creaking step towards the door echoed in the stillness of the basement. It felt wrong, like an invisible force tried to hold him back. He reached for the doorknob and turned it with a decisive twist. As the door swung open, darkness gave way to the dim light of the hallway. And there she was, the silhouette of the woman in black, standing mere inches away, her cold gaze burrowing into his soul. Frozen in terror, Caleb's mind raced, searching for an explanation or escape. The ritual had worked, hadn't it? Or was this another cruel trick, a reminder that he would never be free? Without a chance to process what was happening, Caleb's body suddenly went numb, and he tumbled backwards, descending the stairs with alarming speed. And then darkness engulfed him.